Evening, everyone, and welcome to Closing the Equity Gap. My name is Michelle Eisenberg, and I am a program assistant at the NASDAQ Entrepreneurial Center. And for those of you who may not know, the NASDAQ Center is a nonprofit that's building a better path for entrepreneurs worldwide by improving inclusion, access, and knowledge in entrepreneurship. So as you will see in the chat in a moment, the NASDAQ Center provides programs, resources, and exceptional mentorship to entrepreneurs across all races, industries, and geographies. So definitely make sure to check out those links and resources in the chat. And then just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. First, let us know where you're dialing in from in the chat. Secondly, we're going to open up for a live Q&A at the end of the event, so please submit your questions for us in the Q&A function that's at the bottom of your screen, and we will try our best to get to all of them. All right, welcome everyone. Arizona, Missouri, Chicago, Texas. Welcome to all. And of course, none of what we do could be possible at the center without all of the amazing support from our sponsors, including NASDAQ, Lehigh University, Bank of the West, Airbnb, KPMG, Wilson Sonsini, Woodruff Sawyer, Microsoft Entrepreneurship for Positive Impact, BPM, and HubSpot for Startups. We are humbled by their contributions and hope you are grateful too. And so before we get started, we always like to launch a couple polls to step back and see how everyone's doing today. So I'm going to launch this first poll. How are you feeling? Fearful, anxious, surviving, or optimistic? Give everyone a second to submit a response. Thank you for participating. All right, I'm going to end this poll and share these results. Optimism is in the lead. We love to see that, but we do have some feelings of surviving. So hopefully our conversation will help with those feelings today. All right, I'm going to stop sharing this poll and launch the second one. What is keeping you up at night? This one tells us a little bit about your current entrepreneurial needs. So I'll give it just a couple more moments to give everyone a chance to respond. Perfect. Thank you. All right. I'm going to end this one and share these results. Finance is in the lead, fitting for our conversation today. Also got marketing, skill, team. We will take this all into account as we develop more programs for everyone. All right, I'm gonna stop sharing this poll. And without any further delay, please join me in giving a warm welcome to our special guests, Freada Kapor Klein and Mitch Kapor, founding partners at KPort Capital and co-chairs of the nonprofit Kapor Center in Oakland, California, and co-authors of Closing the Equity Gap, Creating Wealth and Fostering Justice in Startup Investing. Freada, Mitch, thank you both so much for joining us today. We are so grateful to have you here.
We're delighted to be here. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, let's jump right in. First, just before we kind of jump into the main discussion, I'd love to kind of get to know a little bit about each of you, kind of what's led you to the careers that you work in today, maybe some of the moments that have inspired you and stuck with you.
Sure. I can start. I have a long career in tech. Back in the Paleolithic era of the 1980s, I started a company called Lotus that did a spreadsheet and then did Lotus Notes, was a high explosive growth kind of company.
Okay.
Along the way, did some other things, co-founded the Electronic Frontier Foundation,
Mm-hmm.
but I've been an angel investor for a very long time. And that was the origin of what we've been doing at KPort Capital, because Freada, who'll tell you about her background in a second, really nudged and encouraged me in a certain direction, which is to invest more in line with my personal values. But let me turn to her and talk about where she comes from. Then you can see how the two work strands came together.
But I've been a longtime activist on issues of social and racial justice. I grew up believing and acting on the notion that none of us are free until all of us are free.
Yeah.
And so that propelled me in many directions, but I also wanted that applied to business, not just the nonprofit world, and to see if we could infuse that kind of empathy and that kind of inclusion into business and especially into tech startups.
Right. So I think a lot of like what's coming out from what you're saying right now is like really coming back to like ingraining the values that you carry with you and kind of like a sense of goodness in the work that you're doing. And that's really a lot of what KPort Capital is about and really what your book is about. So what has kind of made each of you realize that it was possible to make money and do good at the same time without compromising either one? And maybe Freada, we can start with you this time.
Well, so I'm trained as a researcher, a PhD in social policy and research. And so I pay very close attention to rigorous data. And for many, many years, there's a growing body of research from people like McKinsey that say there is absolutely a link between diversity and innovation. There's absolutely a link between diversity and overall financial performance of a company. And so it's been quite surprising to me why so many venture capitalists ignore that data and continue to invest in ways that they always have. My own research points to, at the Kapor Center, we did a tech leaver study in 2017, looking at who leaves tech and why. And we found that the reasons for Black employees are different than the reasons for white women, than the reasons for Latinas, than the reasons for LGBTQ. So you really begin to understand how important the culture of a company is. And so if you can build an intentional culture that is completely fused with the purpose of the business, you have a great place to work and financial outperformance.
Interesting. Do you have anything to expand upon that?
Sure. I mean, our faith that investing in line with values could be profitable really comes out of our shared experience. Chapter one of which was in the 1980s at Lotus. Freada was hired as the founder CEO. Her job description was to make Lotus the most progressive employer in the US. And in fact, we had all sorts of initiatives and did things which are still not being done today. So when we got together as a couple a dozen years later, we already had a shared experience of challenging some conventional wisdom under our belt. The other thing I would say is the whole tech industry has gotten where it's gotten by not only by taking risks, but by challenging conventional wisdom. Nobody believed that personal computers would be a thing. People actually didn't believe the internet was going to be a thing until all of a sudden, unexpectedly, it was in the mid 90s. So the idea that investing for impact doesn't have to be concessionary, even though it violates the conventional wisdom, us tech disruptors go, so what? Let's be empirical. Let's do an experiment. Let's find out for ourselves. And that's exactly what we did.
I love it. And I have just a quick follow-up question because I'm curious if you have kind of any insight into what is holding businesses or venture capitalists in particular, what is holding them back from making that decision with all of this like mounting evidence, you know?
Yeah, well, I think that there is some inertia that as much as venture capital prides itself on being cutting edge, it's seems to me it's only cutting edge in what they invest in, not how they operate their own firms, not how they think, not how they hire. And so I think there's a bit of a disconnect there, and that's something that we would really like to encourage other venture capitalists to follow what has been an enormously impactful and profitable route.
So important. I love it. All right. So, kind of going back to that decision, that realization of like how you can make money, you can do good at the same time without compromising either one. When you kind of launched this business, how was that decision initially received in the investment community?
Well, there was skepticism. In fact, I myself was skeptical at first. I didn't know. We had some colleagues we were working with who were so skeptical, they decided not to stay on board and went on to conventional careers in venture capital, missing out on all the opportunities. And people in general in the investment community just thought, oh, we were out on some strange limb again, which we were sawing off behind ourselves. So there was some skepticism to begin with, but Freada had an idea centered around gap closing. The idea that you could have invest in companies whose central purpose was to close gaps, perhaps of access or of opportunity or outcome. And it could be in ed tech or fintech or workplace or health. It's not about the sector. It's really about that the beneficiary of the product or service are people from low-income communities or communities of color. And if that was the central tenet of the investment thesis, and that's what we began our experiments around, and decided in 2011 to go all in on that we would just do that 100%. And over the next decade, we achieved top quartile results, top 25% of financial returns compared with all venture funds, of a comparable size. And we published that in our impact report. So that was the evidence. That was the results of the experiment. It really is possible.
But I think it's important to emphasize what Mitch said. Every business we've invested in is a tech startup. It has to be tech because tech is what makes something scalable. And so the core business is about driving impact. It's not impact as an afterthought. It's not impact in a Tom Shoe model, buy one, give one away, because you can always undo that. So we were looking for a commitment in the core business that couldn't be taken away, that couldn't be diluted, or couldn't be walked back on. We wanted the business to be in the purpose of gap closing.
And so this is, I think, really helpful for the entrepreneurs in our audience, so much of whom are working towards a lot of similar goals, under this umbrella. And so I kind of want to dive a little bit deeper into what makes these businesses, what gives them the potential, such high potential to grow and expand?
Well, I think it's really important to say when we're looking at a business, our investment criteria emphasize the gap closing, but we're also looking at the entrepreneurs, the founders, a bit differently than traditional venture capital firms. Sure. We don't care if you have a degree, let alone a degree from Stanford in computer science and worked at Google. So sort of the standard stuff that Sandhill Road venture capitalists care about, we don't care about. What we care about is that the entrepreneur's lived experience helped identify the problem that they are building a business to solve. So it's that intimate knowledge. It is that passion about fixing something that was in their own way, in the way of their family, in the way of their community. And that's what gets somebody to persist through the inevitable hard times. And we're certainly living through one of those right now. This is a very hard time to be a startup entrepreneur. And it's that passion about who you want to help and why that really makes the difference often between carrying someone through a rough patch and not. It isn't the degree or where the degree is from that gets you through these kinds of situations.
Totally.
If I could add, on top of that, there really are enormous unsolved social problems in this country that affect a much larger proportion of the population than are targeted by usual Silicon Valley startups. And if you have that, in your vision, and you find founders whose own lived experiences, Freada said, have led them to an insight about a problem, entrepreneurs turn problems into opportunities. And so the entrepreneurs in our portfolio are tackling some of the biggest unsolved social problems, and they have a huge TAM.
Right. Yeah. I love this emphasis on lived experience, as, businesses are realizing not that customers never have, but that customers value like feeling seen by the entity that's kind of solving their problem for them, that they're trusting to solve their problem. That really matters in the decision that they're making. So I kind of just want to ask a quick follow-up question of like, what steps can founders take to kind of develop their understanding of or like support for the lived experiences of the people that they're trying to serve?
Well, I think that empathy and coming from that community and sharing that experience of that hurdle is really essential.
Okay.
Because it gives an intimate knowledge. And when we talk, in fact, about the team, we were the first venture capital firm to put a founder's commitment in place. We did that in 2016, more than 7 years ago. Yeah. And we said, we are not going to write a check to a founder who doesn't make a commitment to building a diverse team and an inclusive culture. And this wasn't some performative check the box exercise. This wasn't a quote unquote quota. This was about building a better business. So we don't set the metrics for them. We say, look, we want your workforce. We want the team that you hire to reflect your customers. And so if you're an ed tech company and you are actually building something for Title I schools, meaning schools that serve low-income neighborhoods where a majority of kids are eligible for free or reduced lunch, we want you to understand what it means to come from that community, and we want your employees to have attended Title I schools. So it's that connection that we think is really important.
So, what can businesses kind of do in their what can they kind of change in their hiring process as they're kind of evaluating or kind of going out and searching for the right people? What are some important considerations they can take into account with that in mind?
So something I learned from Freada, but I fully and wholeheartedly embrace, the conventional metrics by which we evaluate candidates often have a great deal to do with the resume and the credentials on it. It's really a pedigree. I mean, they want, Stanford, computer science major. And the fact of the matter is that's an extremely unreliable sort of thing, because some people just by accidents of birth, the zip code they were born into, their parents' affluence, buying advantages along the way, they're in a path, they just sort of wind up, maybe they're a legacy admit. You can't tell. We really like to look at the concept Freada identified as distance traveled. Where did somebody start in life? And through their own efforts, what hurdles and barriers have they already overcome to get where they've gotten to? Because that tells us a lot about their resilience, their persistence, the kinds of character traits that are a very positive indicator for entrepreneurial success. So we don't care where your degree is from, or even if you have a degree, we're very interested in your distance traveled story and where you've come from and what you've already, done. And so when you hire, whether it's funding founders or hire employees or and so on. If you have that distance traveled lens, you wind up making a very different set of selections of who you hire, and you wind up with a much more diverse set in all dimensions of employees.
Right. And I can just imagine like the ways it even like just changes the way that you would present that job to those that you would be looking for to fill it. It's so many important things to think about. In that regard.
I give you one example, which is if you're trying to build a diverse workforce and you're hiring a manager, a totally obvious in hindsight question to ask when you're interviewing people is, well, what is your experience building and managing diverse teams?
Yeah.
And if you're bringing people on board with that, experience, again, your ranking of who is the most viable candidate is going to be quite different.
Right. And did you want to add anything to that, or you're just agreeing?
Oh, no, he was just kind of thanking me for that. We have, if we can talk about some of our companies, we have many, many, many examples. Many of the entrepreneurs in our portfolio, in the KPort Capital portfolio, and you can see the portfolio at KPortCapital.com. If you look at those entrepreneurs, many of them were passed over by every big name venture capital firm. Wow. And they're now, they've now gone on to raise tens of millions in venture capital funding. They have hundreds, if not, thousands of employees in this really tough environment. They're, having no trouble raising an $80 million Series B as Bitwise did recently. I saw somebody on the chat is from Fresno. Bitwise Industries is based in Fresno. Fresno is not in the top 10 or probably top 20 or maybe even top 100 cities that you might name if you're looking for tech talent. But Irma Olguin Jr. and Jake Soberall are the co-founders, co-CEOs of Bitwise Industries, and they are probably the largest creators of paid tech apprenticeships in the country. They're now in 10 cities. They have close to 1,000 employees. They are transforming not only the individual apprentices' lives, but their families and communities. We heard that Bitwise employees and apprentices, were the majority buyers of real estate in Fresno. New home buyers. So to talk about how do you change an otherwise struggling, overlooked, underestimated city and transform their whole economy.
Right. That's such an incredible and inspiring example. And it just goes to show the potential impact that you can really make if you, put your mind to it with the research and understanding that your customer. I love it. I actually, just briefly, in doing my research on your book, I had read about another business that was part of your portfolio that was really interesting. I'm trying to remember it, but if I remember it, I'll come back to it because it was really interesting. But just to continue on, the diversity in the tech industry has kind of been a conversation for a while. And you definitely have emphasized like the importance. But there isn't, in your book, you argue that we haven't made much progress. So what more is there to do? And like, how can we better implement diversity and inclusion efforts in Silicon Valley and beyond?
Well, unfortunately, there's still everything to do because there has been so little progress made that if you think about it, literally billions of dollars have been spent every year for at least the past decade, and for some companies longer, and we've barely moved the needle. And if you think about the amount of change in the demographics of the country in those 10 years, if you look at how much progress the tech sector has made, it's actually backsliding against the available talent out there. So I think that there has to be a real reckoning and a real understanding of where there are so many inherent biases in how the standard issue Silicon Valley tech playbook, how it looks at hiring, how it looks at which entrepreneurs get funded, how it looks at allocating capital. Everything about the process needs to be rethought. And we think everybody needs to start at their own firm. Who's sitting around that investment decision-making table? Who's got check writing power? And one of the things I think we see a parallel both on the employment side and on the check writing side is that we often hire people who look like us, who look like the majority. We hire people based on potential if we have confidence in them, from their resume, from their pedigree, or they look like us. Similarly, we fund entrepreneurs for their vision about the business if we have confidence, if they look like successful entrepreneurs that we've seen out in the media or that we've funded before. When it comes to hiring or writing a check to an entrepreneur who is different, we tend to be very conservative. We tend to say, oh no, I can't hire you on potential. I have to hire you or promote you based on what you've already done. And the same thing, I'm only going to write you a small check until I see that you can execute. In both cases, it's a double standard. In both cases, we make it harder, whether it's the employee or the entrepreneur, we make it much, much harder for them to succeed. And so there really is a double standard.
Right. So I think for, a lot of founders, are maybe like starting to kind of think about like moments where they could have potentially had an interaction similar to that, or, witnessed something in that nature. So what can entrepreneurs really do in their business interactions today to start to make a difference in that regard, whether or not they may, be like a powerful Silicon Valley business? Like, how can they make that small impact in their own way?
Well, I think we both can answer. Our partner, Brian Dixon at KPort Capital, after George Floyd was murdered, all of us were besieged with emails and outreach saying, can you help us find a Black entrepreneur to fund? And as Mitch says,
some people were coming to us asking as though they expected to say, oh, no, over in aisle 12, you're in aisle 6, you need Black fund, you got to move to aisle 12. And of course, that's not how it works.
Right.
So what Brian's Medium post, Brian Dixon wrote this Medium post. So you want to fund a Black entrepreneur, start with your own team. Look at who are you hiring? And one of the things is that
this was addressed to investors specifically.
Yes. Because it was, so you want to fund Black entrepreneurs. And so he pointed out that most VC firms don't even post their partner jobs. They tap their network. And so based on his Medium post, 2 very prominent venture capital firms, one East Coast, one West Coast, first round capital on the East Coast and Initialize on the West Coast, they each give Brian and Brian's Medium post credit. They posted their jobs and they each hired their first Black partner. And so that's one of the things we can say is that make an intentional effort to broaden your network. Where do you look for talent? But also make an intentional effort to take the bias out of how you screen candidates.
Mhm.
You're not going to get anywhere if you just keep duplicating the same profile. You want different perspectives at the table to make sure that you're really investing in the best business.
Let me give another practical example. This is going to be about a company called interviewing.io, which offers a service by which for doing anonymized technical interviews, so that you can interact and just answer the questions, have the conversation. It even uses voice masking. Now, why is this a big deal? Well, it turns out, this is so interesting, that they've placed, I don't know, hundreds, thousands of candidates successfully, many of whom submitted their resumes and were rejected on the basis of the resume. Because it didn't, as we were talking about before, it didn't have the right, credentials or pedigree. But if they got into a situation where they could actually show what they do to the recruiter or to the hiring manager through a technical interview, they actually shined and they got hired. It's to the point that there's an enormous amount of underestimated and overlooked talent at all levels, and that there are tools and services. We, in fact, have a whole sector in our portfolio of people, ops, tech companies that offer something to help with the whole talent chain to reduce, to reduce bias. And so you can look on the KPort Capital website at those companies, because if you're doing hiring, maybe you want to use one of those tools. Once you start looking, you see there are a lot of resources of specific small steps that you can take.
Well, in fact, interviewing.io, the founder, Aileen Lerner, is an engineer by training, has been a recruiter. So you talk about relevant lived experience. She's brought it all to bear in what she's built. This anonymized platform, people don't see your LinkedIn profile. People don't see a resume. The hiring manager is up there interacting with you online, doing a real-time coding exercise. Right. So if you get hired, you're the best coder. And then after you've hired that person, you find out that this is a Black single mom who learned to code in the Army. But it doesn't matter where she learned to code. She's already proved that she was the best coder out of all of the candidates. Right. And yet the algorithms that screen resumes screened her out. In fact, 40% of the people hired off of the interviewing.io platform had applied previously and had been screened out at or before the phone screening level. They didn't even get a chance to code. So think about how that plays out in every job type, and think about the wasted and overlooked talent that could be helping your business, that could be helping your community, that could be helping the US economy.
Right. It kind of makes you just think about how we can get stuck in the way that we've always done things and be like, oh, well, this is kind of just it. What else is there? And it's like there are other ways, and there are better ways.
Exactly.
So I love it. And so I want to kind of turn specifically to the bias that it still exists in the investment community. Particularly for women and people of color. So what are some ways that this, manifests, maybe some of like the subtle ways that are harder to recognize? And what steps can venture capital firms take to start to actively offset this inequity?
Well, let's talk about warm intros. It's been a standard practice forever that the way you get, if you're pitching to a VC, is you get somebody that they know to give you a warm intro. This is incredibly biased because it keeps the networks restricted and closed. We, to our knowledge, we're the first firm to say we don't require a warm intro. There's a process on the website. You can submit an inquiry. We're very clear about what our investment criteria are. The investment team spends a lot of time carefully going through the several thousand inquiries we get a year in this fashion. But the fact of the matter is we sometimes fund people that not only do we not know, we're not connected with, we couldn't know. Since we started that no warm intros requirement, other firms have begun copying it. So there are now quite a few. That opens up the process. It is more inclusive. It gives people who wouldn't otherwise, entrepreneurs, be heard, have a chance. So that's one example of a practical thing that venture firms can do.
Right.
We did a study out of Kapor Center, out of the philanthropic arm, a few years ago on what's it like to be a female entrepreneur and what are the experiences of female entrepreneurs while pitching VCs. So all women of all backgrounds, the majority of 77% had experienced some kind of bias while pitching, condescending remarks, questions about, were they moms or intending to become moms, or doubting their expertise. But then when you took an intersectional look, it turns out that there are very different kinds of biases directed at white women versus Asian women versus Latinas versus Black women. And it's very important to understand that it is Black female entrepreneurs and Latina entrepreneurs that are subjected to far greater rates of bias, including they're nearly 10 times as likely to be hit on by venture capitalists compared to white and Asian women. So important to look, when we're talking about female entrepreneurs, at the common biases as well as the very distinct kinds of biases when we have that intersectional lens. Right. But we've seen a drop in funding to all women entrepreneurs from 21 to 22. It went from a whopping, I'm saying that sarcastically, it went from a whopping 2.4% of all venture capital went to all women teams, dropped to 1.9%. And we see a similar fate, for example, for Black entrepreneurs, both male and female entrepreneurs, whereas the drop in overall venture capital was 36% of funding. The drop in funding to Black entrepreneurs was 45%. So what we see is whatever jump we made post George Floyd or in the boom years of 2020, 2021, that's all been erased. We're backsliding.
What do you, just quickly, what do you think are some of the reasons of like why that may be? Some may be more obvious, some may not.
Well, look, I think that there was a lot of kind of guilt and a lot of sheep-like behavior post the murder of George Floyd. And so everybody had to put their little box on Twitter. Everybody had to make their pledge. When the Washington Post did an investigation, nearly $50 billion was pledged by corporations, venture capital firms, about doing something about racial equity post George Floyd's murder. They could only track 0.5% of those pledges had been made good. So what we're seeing is a huge disconnect between what's stated and what's practiced. So we need ways to hold those folks accountable to the pledges they made and to really help them. If they have a well-intentioned pledge and don't have a clue about how to go about it, let's give them a menu of options. Here's how you can make a real difference about racial equity in venture capital.
And so just another quick follow-up. Are there do you have or know of any models or templates of accountability or kind of just measuring that, how that's being done in any way?
There are lots of organizations out there tracking it, and it's not rocket science. If you say we're going to increase our hiring or we're going to increase our funding of Black, Latinx, and women founders by X%, you go back and you ask for the data. Right. So transparency is an enormous prerequisite to accountability.
Amazing. So I want to quickly switch gears as we're getting closer to the live Q&A, and just touch on ESG, and as that's becoming so much higher of a priority for businesses, understanding the importance of like what each of those tenets mean and why it's so important for their business. What makes the authentic implementation of ESG factors into all aspects of the business a corporate fiduciary responsibility, and not just like a smart strategic move, or something that should be done for reputational purposes, if that makes sense?
Yeah, well, here's the thing about ESG, which is that it's a great idea at a high level, which we endorse, but we're not really proponents of ESG criteria as currently constructed because they lack rigor. We don't have common definitions. We don't have metrics. And if you call yourself ESG and rely on it, you're really in danger of what Freada calls, enacting performative nonsense. What we do think does work is to have very specific criteria for your own business that you hold yourself accountable to and you make public that is appropriate to what you do. So for instance, we believe in gap closing, and we can talk very specifically what we mean by gap closing when we talk about ed tech, for instance. What is the percentage of students being served who are in Title I schools that serve low-income communities, and so on. Over time, I think there does need to be effort and work to come up with cross-sector definitions of impact. But if we don't have them as yet that really work, and we shouldn't, pretend that we do. Another thing that companies can do is to become a public benefit corporation, not a B Corp, which is a voluntary nonprofit certification, but a public benefit corporation is where you actually amend your corporate charter to put your mission of your specific business in it, and sets out how you want to be held accountable to it. It provides the founders and the management actually some ground to stand on with shareholders and others, in that they must legally then pursue those mission objectives, not just a profit. And then your criterion are out there, and you've put a stake in the ground, and that's something that people can look at and evaluate how you are doing. And so ESG is unfortunately now caught up in the in the culture wars. We are big believers in businesses defining themselves, being very, very clear about it. I'll say one last thing. We always make the distinction between things that businesses do that are peripheral and things that are central. Like, you can get a lot of points in certain quarters if you have enough recycling waste baskets in your offices. And yes, you should recycle, but what's much more important is, well, what is the central purpose of the business itself? And if it succeeds, who is better off and who is worse off? Are you closing gaps? Are you bringing the top and bottom together? And that is a question that anybody can ask, even as we develop more rigorous and more universal standards.
Totally. And that's just another great example of kind of a scenario where entrepreneurs are kind of going to be like, I can think outside of the box. That's kind of been set for me, that I thought this was it. I thought this was the gold standard, and there's a better way to do it. So I love this perspective that you're bringing to these concepts. Before we jump into live Q&A, I want to kind of close out this conversation, and just reflect on your experience with Kapor Capital, the work that you've done in widening access to founders, looking for early investors. And so kind of just touching, we've talked a lot about the ways that venture capital firms can make a difference. And so I want to get some insight from you, on some ways that employees, consumers, shareholders can kind of join alongside that effort.
Well, I think there's a very important mechanism that has yet to be flexed, if you will, and that is whether you are an employee or, as you said, a customer. Many people, probably everybody who's listening, has a 401k, and so I want to challenge people. Do you have any idea what your 401k is invested in? Do you have any idea who the investment manager is? Do you have any idea how that investment manager was hired or what their criteria are for success? And so for everyone who did go to college, before you write your alumni association check, I don't care if it's $10 or 10,000 or 10 million, do you know where your university endowment is invested? Is it actually invested in things that are gap widening and making it harder for people to access higher education? Is it increasing student loan debt? So I think each and every one of us can become more educated about where our dollars are and whether they are fueling gap widening or gap closing efforts. So I would encourage that. I do think there's literally trillions of dollars in foundation endowments and university endowments. And I think a groundswell of activity that says university endowments, college endowments, foundation endowments ought to be invested consistent with mission. And to have that kind of push. Many decades ago, there was a lot of activism on campuses and beyond to not do business with companies under apartheid in South Africa. There was later and has been a lot of activity on campuses and elsewhere about not investing in fossil fuels. Along the way, there was not investing in tobacco. Why aren't we saying, let's not invest in gap widening, inequality promoting activities? We can have the same kind of public awareness and public campaign.
Right. And I love the examples that you gave, because it gives people the opportunity to think about the little moments in their life where they actually might have a voice. I think for a lot of people, it's easy to want to kind of just change the world. And that's such a heartwarming thought. But it can be more practical to kind of make a difference in your little piece of the world. So I love that inspiration you gave. Okay, let's dive into Q&A. We already have some questions coming in from the audience. So please, if you are in the audience and you have a question for Mitch and Freada, please drop it in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. All right, so let's jump in. There's a really interesting question that came in here that I want to touch on. So it's kind of about, I think it's really about like a sense of hopelessness and kind of like touching on like this pullback from prioritizing diversity in the last couple of years. So like this person is asking, like, how can we ensure that this is a passing moment and that we don't kind of like accept this as just the way things are?
And what's the specific reference about the culture wars or about?
About just in reference to the gap in access to equity specifically, and kind of just
Wall Street Journal op-ed about Kapor Capital brought down SVB one. Yeah.
Is that the same one?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So look, I do think there are certainly moments where we all feel dispirited or hopeless, but let's not forget that each and every one of us has some power. We have power to vote. We've seen some elections this week that were surprising and turned things around. We also ought to, use our vote with our feet as employees about which businesses we want to work at and make successful and which ones not. For those of you who are founders, it is what is the purpose or mission? And are you seeking values-aligned investors, or are you hiding your impact and hiding your diversity goals because everybody told you to take it out of your deck? Well, if we all take it out of our deck, we can't find each other. And so I think in these difficult moments where there's a lot of pushback in the society, it's when we need to all speak out and act in concert more, not less. If we just go to the sidelines, people don't know that we are opposed to what's going on.
Love it. Another question here that we have, kind of touching on the challenges of for businesses who are working in some manner towards closing the equity gap. So how do you kind of advise these founders as they struggle through like the unique challenges of working towards that type of impact?
Well, no panacea here, but let me say one thing that we found very valuable is to have conversations with founders, both before and after we've invested, about who else they get to invest in their companies and helping them find investors who are aligned with them about their mission. So rather than being scared to ask the tough questions, you're getting into a deep relationship with an investor when you take their money. You're not just taking their money, you're going into business with them. And you want to have, as a founder, investors that are going to support you because they believe in what you're doing. We know every business goes through ups and downs. It is absolutely inevitable. And what you don't want to have happen as a founder is when you hit the speed bump for your investors to tell you, get rid of the impact, because we don't care about that. We just care about the money. Or worse than that, they throw you off the bus right away because you're now superfluous. So one way to remain hopeful and to be more successful is to be very thoughtful about finding aligned capital at each and every stage, so you're not in it alone. Hard to do, but doable, particularly these days at the pre-seed and seed stages. There are quite many more aligned investors than there used to be.
I think another part of this question, if I'm reading the same question here, is being focused as a founder is critically important. And while we see interconnectedness of these issues, it is not for any one founder to take on any and every and all forms of inequity. So that our founders focus, the Bitwise founders focused on what they wanted to do to give access to alternative pathways into tech. Promise, that might have been the company you were thinking about before. Promise Pay.
Yes, Promise Pay
wants to help treat low-income people with respect and dignity, making it very easy for them to pay things like their utilities, their water bills, to be able to do it from their phone, to set the amount they want to pay, to set the date that it's due, no fees, no interest. And so they get calls into their customer success line with customers sobbing about, you've changed my life. I'm out of debt. I'm helping my credit score. No one's ever been so kind to me. And the cities or the utilities or whoever they're helping pay bills, in most instances, the city of Newark, the state of Virginia, they thought they were never going to get that money. So the city or the county or the state wins by getting revenue they never thought they would get. The customer is treated as they always should have been treated, with dignity and respect. And in the process, Promise is building a huge profitable business.
Yeah, that was exactly the one, because I think I was reading about her story of waiting in the lunch line. Was that her story? Yeah. And that was just really powerful. So I'm glad you ended up bringing that one up. All right. So before we kind of close out, I think we have time for one more question. I think authenticity is a word that's like thrown around a lot these days, a lot in the business world. So I kind of want to ask, how can venture capital entities do the work of closing the equity gap in a way that is authentic and not just acting on knowledge of what's profitable?
Well, I think the venture capitalist will have to be willing to challenge the conventional wisdom of the field, because it is conventionally about making as much money as possible for your limited partners. It's greed first or greed only, as Freada sometimes says. If you have that stance, you are not going to be closing gaps.
Right.
And so it requires holding up a mirror and looking at yourself and, is this who I want to be? And if it's not who you want to be as an investor, then, it is time to start thinking about doing some of the things differently that we've been talking about here.
I think too many venture capital firms, as we saw with, what happened after George Floyd was murdered, they're not interested in changing anything about how they operate. They're not interested in changing how they hire, how they invest. But when there's something that crops up and gets their attention and actually, and they're genuinely concerned, they were genuinely moved by the murder of George Floyd, they do something over on the side. They set up, they run a multi-billion-dollar fund, and they set up a $10 million fund to invest in Black entrepreneurs. Many firms did things like that.
Right.
That kind of thinking, that this is ancillary, this is philanthropy, this is a rounding error, and it actually doesn't matter whether these kinds of businesses make money or lose money. That is part of the problem. That is not part of the solution.
So, okay, we are about to close out. We're running out of time, but for those who, theoretically missed some of what you said, what would be the one most important thing that you would want the audience to take away from this conversation, from your book, Closing the Equity Gap?
That there is a different way, that standard issue venture capital is not the only way. It's not even the most profitable way, and it's certainly not the fairest, most equitable way.
And just as tech has shown that amazing things can happen through innovation, we can also innovate in our institutions and in our social relationships, the way Freada is saying.
I love it. Mitch, Freada, thank you both so much for joining us today, giving us such an incredible overview of your book. Please, everyone, go out and read Closing the Equity Gap. It's an amazing read, super important. Thank you both again so much on behalf of the NASDAQ Entrepreneurial Center and everyone in attendance today. We are sincerely grateful.
Well, thank you. It's certainly been a pleasure, and we appreciate having this conversation.
Amazing. And to our audience, we would love for you to join us again for upcoming webinars. You can view them by using the link that's going to be posted in the chat. Thank you all so much for joining us today, and we look forward to welcoming you back online with us soon.